What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Blade, and we're back. Some more disturbing horror reactions. Today, we got your boy Yapmaster back with another banger. Disturbing horror movies based on terrifying real cases. You already know this is gonna be a banger video. First things first, make sure to like and subscribe. Road to 500 subs. You guys have been going crazy the last 2 videos. You guys have been commenting and subscribing and watching. We are getting bigger views. And I thank each and every one of you for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. You the best. You the best. Anyways, without further ado, let's start this video. Okay, already first, I already know Texas Chainsaw Massacre is going to be on this list.
These are the most shocking stories behind horror movies inspired by real events, and as the video goes on, the truth behind these movies will shift from strange and creepy to truly frightening and dark. In 2017, the blockbuster movie Veronica was produced and released. It follows a teenage girl in Madrid who accidentally summons a demonic presence after performing a seance with a Ouija board during a solar eclipse. Soon, terrifying supernatural events take over her home and threaten her younger siblings as the entity grows stronger. The film has become infamous as the scariest movie on Netflix, with reports claiming that only about 1 out of 100 viewers managed to finish it, and even
If I could, I would. I'm not even gonna hold you. I will watch this movie and react to it, but I can't because it's copyright. But if I could, I would. I would watch this entire movie and not be scared at night. I want to watch it after recording this video now. Called Veronica, okay. Said to be the scariest movie ever made. Netflix said only 1 out of 100 were able to watch the full film. Yeah, you know, they said that a lot about movies, okay? They said Paranormal Activity 1 had people getting heart attacks and getting kicked out of the theater. Not kicked out of the theater, just getting freaking carried on a stretcher. They said that with the Conjuring. They said that with... What's the other movie? I don't know, I forgot. Hereditary. Yeah, okay, they say that a lot, okay? Now me, I watched all of those and I wasn't like scared. Why else am I doing this channel? Because I'm not scared.
viewers took to social media to complain that it had left them quaking and sleepless. But as horrifying as the movie was, it still wasn't as disturbing.
Freaking stop being a baby, okay? Bro, I watched the latest Final Destination in theaters, like when it came out, like near that week. And the people in front of me were like 2 teenage girls. And I went with my sister. And then after the movie, both of them were like shook. And I was like, yo, it's not even that scary, bro. They were like, that was so scary. I was like, what are you talking about, bro? For me, that was just entertaining, bro. I was like, oh, the creative kills. Okay, very nice. But yeah, those 2 girls were like, that was so scary. I was like, yo, relax, bro. If you think that's scary, you have not watched a lot of scary movies. Alright, anyways.
As the real story. In real life, the entire incident takes us to a small home in Spain, in a small neighborhood called Vallecas, where the actual Veronica character lived. Her name was Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro. Estefania lived with her mother, father, and younger brothers and sisters. She was an ordinary person who got wrapped up in an event that completely altered the course of her life. And it all began when she and her friends started messing around with a Ouija board. In the film, Veronica tries to speak to her dead father. They went into the basement of their school with their Ouija board, while the nuns and the rest of the students watched the eclipse on the roof. But in real life, Estefania and her friends were trying to contact the dead boyfriend of one of her friends. He'd passed away in a motorcycle accident. At first, nothing happened. They were giggling and whispering like normal teenagers. But suddenly, one of the strictest nuns in the school barged into the basement, catching them in the middle of the seance. She got angry and shouted at them for summoning spirits in school before grabbing the board and breaking it in half. And this turned out to be a very huge mistake, because the next moment, a small cloud of white smoke would emerge from the broken board, moving straight toward Estefania's face. It was as if it entered her nose and mouth. And from then on, Estefania's life was never the same. Days after the seance, Estefania started having strange episodes, seizures, and panic attacks. And sometimes she would stare at nothing for long minutes, and other times she shook like she was freezing. She would also scream without knowing why. Her mother took her to a lot of doctors. They couldn't explain the seizures, and they couldn't explain these sudden panic attacks, and overall they just couldn't explain her strange behavior. Estefania told her mother that dark shadows with no faces stood around her bed at night, whispering, and that these shadows came every night and got worse over time. In the movie, Veronica also sees similar dark shapes, but multiple times throughout the day, unlike Estefania, who experienced it mostly at night. Now her mother tried to comfort her, but nothing helped. Estefania became weaker as the months passed, and she could no longer attend school. Instead, she would sleep during the day and wake up screaming at night. Now whenever she was able to catch some sleep, Estefania would feel someone touch her feet while she slept, and sometimes she would even hear voices calling her name. Other times she growled or cried out of nowhere, and they tried everything they could, doctors, therapists, and even visits to the church, but nobody actually had answers. And then on August 14th, 1991, after months of fear and confusion, Estefania suddenly collapsed. Her body shook violently, and her mother rushed her to the hospital, and her seizure turned into a coma, but the doctors couldn't actually save her. She died the next day. She was only 18 years old. And the most shocking part of the story was that the doctors couldn't even explain the cause of death. There was no serious sickness, no injury, and no medical reason that made sense. Her death was listed as sudden and unexplained. Her family believed the darkness would leave her after she died. They thought that the shadows followed her and not them, but actually the opposite happened. After her death, the strange activity inside the house became worse than ever. Now in the movie, Veronica's story ends quickly after her final moment, but in real life, the nightmare continued long after the girl was gone. At home, the situation grew even more frightening. Her brothers and sisters said that they heard knocking on the walls at night, doors opened themselves, and lights went off for no reason. And her parents claimed that they sometimes even heard someone walking in the hallway even when everyone was asleep. Now her siblings claimed that they saw a tall, shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway at night. Her mother also said that she heard someone whispering "Mama" in Estefania's old room, but when she got there, it was simply empty. And even her father revealed that somebody pushed him while he slept, even though no one else again was in the room. One day, even a picture of Estefania that hung on the wall suddenly caught on fire from the inside, and only the image burned. The glass covering the picture didn't break, and the wall behind it stayed untouched. And of course, her family couldn't explain how this could have happened. They said it felt like the house was angry. In 1992, things became even worse. One night, Estefania's mother woke up and felt something heavy pressing down on her. She said it felt like invisible hands were grabbing her feet and arms, and she struggled until the feeling finally stopped. And this frightening moment made the family call the police for help. Now the police arrived at 2:40 a.m. and they found the entire family crying and shaking outside the building.
What the hell is the police gonna do?
Too scared to actually step back inside, so the officers went in themselves, and what they saw became one of the most famous police reports in Spain's history. The officers claimed they saw a wooden closet shaking by itself, as well as a heavy table moving across the room without no one touching. The doors of the cupboards were opening and closing, and an unidentified slimy object dripped from the bedside table. One officer said he felt someone tap him on his shoulder. When he turned around, nobody was actually there. They also heard loud knocks coming from inside the walls, even though the apartment was empty and quiet. The police had no explanation for any of this, but they wrote everything down in their official report. And this was one of the biggest reasons that this case became so famous, because the police themselves said strange things had happened. After the police visit, the family could no longer stay in the apartment. The fear was too overwhelming. The children couldn't sleep, and their parents were exhausted. And so they quickly packed their things and moved away, leaving some belongings behind because they were too scared to take them. In their minds, the darkness belonged to that house, not to them. But what comes next is even more shocking, because it didn't come from an unknown entity, but an enemy disguised as a friend.
By the time school started.
See, this is what I always think about, like when these paranormal activities that are like documented happen in like the 80s, and this is like I don't want to say recent, but kind of recent. That's 91, 92. Like, why doesn't it happen now? That's always my theory. Like, when they make these horror movies and they're like, this happened in 1980 something or 70 something or 60 something or 50 something. It's like, why did it happen in that era and not, why can't it happen now? That's what I'm saying, bro. Like, if it truly is real, it would happen now. There would be reports now. Bro, that's why there's like doo-doo horror movies where it's like the computer gets possessed. Your phone gets possessed. It's like, bro, that shit is not scary. The only time it would be scary, bro. I need to make a horror film, bro. That's the end of this rant. I can't give away any ideas, bro. I don't know who's watching now, and then they'll steal my idea. But you can definitely make a modern horror movie using fear. Like there was like a movie about like mirrors like years ago, and I remember like people saying they were too afraid to look into the mirror. That's how good they scared them. That's what I would do. I would be like, you're too scared to look at your phone anymore. I'm literally saving people by doing that. You know, no more brain rot. You're too scared to look at your phone. You're too scared to be on the computer. That's the type of movie I would want to make.
The rumors were all out. Where's Elise?
It's
Jennifer
September 18, 2009. Hollywood
Okay, as I said, nothing happens recently. We have 2009. Okay.
director Karen Kusama and writer Diablo Cody have just released their highly anticipated movie, Jennifer's Body. The comedy horror film follows the story of two best friends, Jennifer and Needy, who find themselves in the most horrific
Oh, hold on. Oh, Megan Fox? Hold on. I didn't watch this one. Hold on. I gotta watch it now.
situation imaginable. One night, a band attempted to sacrifice Jennifer to become famous, but the ritual went horribly wrong, and so Jennifer became possessed by a demon and would start eating boys in order to survive. But while Diablo Cody has never outright confirmed that the film was based on real events, there's a deeply unsettling case that bears an eerily close resemblance to the movie's plot. It's the night of July 2nd, 1995, in the quiet coastal town of Arroyo Grande, California. A young girl named Elise Marie Powler steps out of her house after receiving a phone call from a friend. She tells her parents that she'll be only gone for a few minutes, but Elise never comes home. Hours later, the streets grow silent, but somewhere near her neighborhood, three teenage boys are committing one of the most shocking and senseless killings in California history. In the months before that night, Elise became friends with three boys who lived nearby: Jacob Delaschmut, Joseph Fiorella, and Royce Cassie. At first, they just seemed like normal teenagers who were into music. Now, Elise knew that they drank and smoked, and she didn't mind. But as time went on, she learned more about the things they were truly obsessed with, which was heavy metal music. What she wasn't aware of, however, was their obsession with dark symbols, Satanism, and the occult. The boys wanted to start their own band, which they called Hatred, and they were heavily influenced by the American metal band Slayer, especially songs like Altar of Sacrifice, which included lyrics such as "a ritual with a pure sacrifice" and "Satan's slaughter, ceremonial killing." Slayer formed in 1981 and was known for using dark themes in their music and style, and the boys wanted to be just like them. But no matter how hard they tried, their band never actually became popular. They were known only in their neighborhood, and nothing significant came from their music. And that's when Joseph came up with a disturbing idea. He told the others that if they wanted money, fame, and real success, they needed to make a sacrifice to the devil. And Joseph claimed that their sacrifice had to be a young person who had never been intimate with anyone. At first, Jacob and Royce thought the idea was too extreme and too strange to take seriously, but over time, Joseph actually managed to convince them, and slowly, all three boys agreed.
Bro, these guys literally tried to sell. Well, they didn't sell their soul. They sold someone else's soul
To the plan. Elise became their chosen target because she was young, accessible, and fit the criteria Joseph had described. And so on the
Bro, what do you mean? What do you mean accessible?
night of July 22nd, when she received the call from one of the boys, they told her that they just wanted to hang out and maybe smoke and talk for a while. And a short time later, she met them at a eucalyptus grove in the Poma Mesa. They sat together, talked and smoked, and everything seemed normal, and there was nothing to make her think that she was in danger. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. The boys grew unusually quiet, and then, without warning, they carried out the plan they'd secretly discussed for months. Jacob grabbed a belt and wrapped it around Elise's neck. Joseph followed, using a hunting knife to stab her, and after that, Jacob and Royce also used their knives, attacking her again and again. And even after all of this, Elise was still fighting to survive. She hadn't passed away.
Stabbed 12 times? She didn't die instantly.
But Royce then stepped forward and pressed down hard on the back of her neck. And when the boys were certain that Elise had stopped breathing, Jacob then tried to remove her underwear because they talked about harming her further. But Royce actually stopped them. In the end, they dug a shallow hole.
These sick people. He really tried to do the bad. I can't even say the words because of YouTube.
placed Elise's body inside and covered it and left. Now when Elise didn't come home, her parents immediately filed a missing person report, and within days her disappearance gained local attention. Her family distributed flyers and searched tirelessly for her daughter, and for 8 long months Elise was in those woods while her parents held onto the hope that she might still be alive. Meanwhile, the boys stayed silent. They visited the burial site several times, sometimes even out of curiosity, other times simply for the thrill of it. But everything changed on March 14, 1996. Royce Casey walked into the police station and confessed to everything. He said he'd found God and needed to clear his conscience, and then led the officers to Elise's burial site. And after nearly a year of searching, Elise's family finally had answers, though not the outcome they prayed for. Following Royce's confession, all 3 boys were arrested, and during questioning, they each gave similar accounts of what had happened that night. They were initially charged as juveniles, but due to the brutality of the crime, they were moved to adult court, and all 3 were then charged with second-degree murder and ultimately pleaded guilty. At sentencing, Royce Casey received 25 years to life in prison. Jacob Delashmuth received 26 years to life, and Joseph Fiorella also received 26 years. But the story didn't end there. In November 1996, Elise's parents...
The one who confessed only gets a 1 year off.
filed a lawsuit against the band's stay. They believed the band's violent lyrics had influenced the boys and contributed to their daughter's death, and they argued that some songs even sounded like instructions on how to torture or kill someone. But when the actual case went to court, the judge ruled that there was no legal basis to hold Slater responsible, and the lawsuit was actually dismissed. The Pollard family then tried again, claiming the lyrics were harmful to small humans. But that case was also thrown out. The court ruled once again that the band couldn't be blamed for Elise's death. Now in 2025, the case actually resurfaced in the public eye, because on July 1st, 2025, Jacob Delashmuth, now 47 years old, was released on parole, and about a month later, Royce Casey was also released. But the third accomplice, Joseph Fiorella, now 45, remains incarcerated. What comes next, however, was a brutal case of a murder that took even the religious leaders to court.
She never did receive complete deliverance from the demonic oppression, and then she eventually died.
Oh, this movie.
In 2005, the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose was released. Many people thought it was just another scary movie full of demons and dramatic scenes, but it was more than that. The movie was inspired by a real young girl from Germany whose life, suffering, and death became one of the most famous and saddest exorcism cases in modern history.
Bro, what about the original The Exorcist, the 1970s one? I swear that's the first legit cursed movie, because while they were filming, crazy shit was happening. Yeah, I swear one guy died. I swear they said one guy died while filming that movie. That's what that movie I never watched. I watched so many horror movies, but that one in particular, there's like a little fear in me. Even though I say I'm not scared, that movie specifically, there's a fear deep down in my heart that's like, don't watch that movie. But there's a side of me that says you have to watch it because it's such a good movie. But the other side is like, yo, this is some demonic movie at the same time. I don't know, one day I'll watch it though.
Her name was Anneliese Michel, and to understand what happened to her, we have to go back to the very beginning. Anneliese Michel was born on September 21st, 1952 in a small German town called Liebling in the region of Bavaria. Her family was deeply Catholic. They prayed every day, went to church often, and believed strongly in sin, heaven, and hell. Her mother, Anna, was very strict. She expected her children to behave, to pray, and to follow religious rules very carefully. And even though the home was very strict, Anneliese was known as a sweet, quiet girl. She was smart, worked hard in school, and wanted to become a teacher. She loved learning and always tried to do what she believed was right. Nothing seemed unusual about her childhood, and her future looked even bright, and her teachers believed that she would do very well in life. But everything changed when she turned 16. One morning while she was sitting in class, her body suddenly stiffened. She fell to the ground, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak or breathe normally. Her classmates were terrified, and teachers rushed in to help her. Her eyes rolled back and foam came from her mouth. No one actually knew what was happening, and so she was taken into the hospital, and after several tests, the doctors told her family that Anneliese had temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, temporal lobe epilepsy is a condition where the brain has sudden bursts of abnormal activity, and these bursts can cause seizures, strange visions, and intense emotional changes. People with this condition can sometimes hear things that aren't there or feel as if unseen forces are around them. Some even report feeling a presence or experiencing intense fear for no particular reason. Now, doctors prescribed her a medicine called Dilantin, which was supposed to control the seizures, and after a few weeks she also began taking paraziazine, a medication used to treat schizophrenia, agitation, and delusional behavior. They told her that she would be okay if she just stayed on her meds, and for a while things seemed to be better, but soon soon new problems began. Not long after her first seizure, Annalisa started hearing noises at night. She said that she heard knocking on the walls, scratching under her bed, and whispering voices that she couldn't understand. She also felt something heavy pressing against her chest in the dark. She could hardly sleep anymore, and instead she stayed awake most nights, praying the rosary over and over again until the sun came up. These events frightened her, but what frightened her even more was how she began reacting to religious objects. One day when Annalisa tried to walk into a church, her body froze. She felt sick, almost like she wanted to throw up. She said the crucifix on the wall made her feel burning pain, and holy water stung her skin like acid. This made no sense to her or to her family because Annalisa had always loved going to church. She'd always felt safe there, and now she could hardly step inside. Her mother grew worried, but she also believed that when strange things happen around holy objects, it might mean something spiritual is going on. But still, the family took Annalise back to the doctors. They believed her reactions were signs of depression and psychosis mixed with epilepsy, and so the doctors increased her medicine, changed her treatments, and tried different approaches. But nothing helped. Her symptoms only grew stronger. At night, she saw twisted faces laughing at her, and she said they looked like evil, like demons. And sometimes during the day, she smelled terrible odors that no one else could smell, like burned.
If that was me, and that was my child that went to church and they had this reaction, I would immediately be like, all right, let me get the church isn't happening today. Churches can't 12 p.m. mass is canceled. This priest is helping my child right now. You are exercising this child at the church in front of everyone.
Ashes or rotten soil. Her prayers became longer and more desperate, and she began kneeling over and over again on the floor until her skin bruised and her knees swelled. Her parents didn't know what to do anymore, and so they turned to the Catholic Church for help, asking for an
Finally.
exorcism. But the church actually doesn't give permission for exorcisms easily, as the priest must be completely sure that the person is truly possessed, and they had to have ruled out all of the mental illnesses first. And so the church actually told the family to continue medical treatment, and so they did. For 5 long years, Annalise stayed on the medicine. She saw doctor after doctor, but her suffering only grew worse. She became quieter, thinner, and more afraid. She told people that voices followed her everywhere, and that something inside her wanted to control her actions. And she begged for help, saying that she no longer knew what was real and what was not. And at last, in 1974, a priest named Father Ernst Alt visited her. He'd heard about her strange behavior and wanted to see if anything spiritual could be involved. And when he met her, he later wrote a letter to the bishop saying Annalise didn't look like an epileptic. He believed she needed an exorcism. And so the next year, Annalise wrote a letter to Father Ernst Alt in 1975, saying,
I am nothing. Everything about me is vanity. What should I do? I have to improve. You pray for me.
She also once told him,
I want to suffer for other people, but this is so cruel.
Now the bishop, Joseph Stangl, still needed more proof. And so another priest, Father Rodwig, also visited and wrote a long report arguing that Annalise showed signs of real possession. Now at first, the bishop only allowed a small prayer ritual, not a full exorcism. But in September 1975, after reading more reports and hearing more from Father Alt, Bishop Joseph finally gave permission for a major exorcism, but he ordered it to be kept secret. Now the main exorcist was Father Arnold Renz, assisted by Father Alt, and the exorcism began on September 24th, 1975. On that day, Annalise began.
You made a mistake, Yapmaster. What did you just say?
Father Alt, and the exorcism began on September 24th, 1975.
But it says 1965 on the screen. Yapmaster, you made a mistake. It's okay. We make mistakes. It's 1965, guys. As you can see, you guys all have eyes. I just hit my glasses.
On that day, Annalise began increasingly speaking about
Dying to atone for the wayward youth of the day and the apostate priests of the modern church.
and this was the start of a 10-month struggle that would end in tragedy. Each session lasted up to 4 hours. The priest prayed, asked questions, sprinkled holy water, and read ancient Latin prayers from the Ritual Romanum, and they recorded each session, which amounted to 67, and also gathered more than 40 hours of
Don't say it. Don't say it.
audio over time. Now during these months, Annalise's behavior became even more extreme. The priest said she spoke in deep growling noises that didn't sound like her own, and they claimed that several demons inside her gave their names. Among the names she shouted were Lucifer,
This is the actual audio? No way.
Cain, Judas, Nero, Hitler, and a priest named Fleischmann, who'd lived hundreds of years earlier. and this is her normal voice.
Ja, ich wünsche auch für die anderen Leute, alle die neben mir kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar.
Her family said she ate insects, screamed for hours, and tore apart rosaries, and she could barely sleep or eat. Her health worsened quickly. Even her weight dropped below 70 pounds, and her face grew hollow. Sometimes she couldn't even walk without help. Now, Annalise's family stopped bringing her to medical appointments, since they believed that she needed spiritual help instead of medicine. And Annalise herself begged for the exorcisms to continue, saying she wanted to suffer for others, and that this was her mission. But by June 1976, she was extremely weak. Her legs couldn't even hold their own up, and she refused food. Still, she continued praying, whispering to God between long moments of pain and confusion. On July 1st, 1976, after almost a year of exorcisms, Annalise Michel died in her home. She was only 23. Her autopsy showed that she died from starvation and dehydration, and she weighed about 66 pounds. The doctor said she could have been saved if she just received medical care even 1 week before her death. Now, her passing shocked Germany, but the strangest parts of the
Oh, well. This is another one that I watched.
case would soon surface after the state began an investigation. In 1976, the government charged her parents and both priests with negligent homicide, meaning they were blamed for causing her death by failing to get medical help. And the trial began in 1978 and became
Wait, what the heck? What was that then? This is still the same story? I thought this guy transit. Isn't this a movie as well? Lutz family flee murder house after 28 days.
an investigation. In 1976, the government charged her parents and both priests with negligent homicide, meaning they were blamed for causing her death by failing to get medical help. And the trial began in 1978 and became national news. The courtroom was packed every day, and the people argued about whether Annalise had been mentally ill or truly possessed. Doctors testified that she wasn't possessed at all. They said everything she experienced could be explained by epilepsy, psychosis, and the stress of a strict religious upbringing. But the defense argued that her family and the priests believed that they were helping. They said that they'd followed her wishes and also played the tapes from the exorcisms, letting the courtroom hear the growls, cries, and strange voices. Now, in the end, the court found Annalise's parents and both priests guilty of negligent homicide. However, the judge said that the parents had suffered enough, so none of them actually went to jail. The priests, however, received suspended prison sentences and several years of probation. Now, even after the trial ended, her story continued to spread around the world, inspiring books, documentaries, and movies. The most famous was the 2005 movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which told a fictionalized version of the events. Now, after the trial, the Annalise family asked the authorities for permission to dig out her body. They felt she'd been buried too quickly and in a cheap coffin. And so nearly 2 years later, on February 25th, 1978, her remains were taken from the original grave and placed in the outer cemetery, Klingenberg. On June 6, 2013, a fire engulfed the house where the Michel family had lived. And although the local police determined that it was a case of arson, some people in the neighborhood claimed that the home had long carried a dark, uneasy energy connected to Annalise's suffering. No suspect was ever publicly identified, and the true motive behind the blaze remains unknown. Annalise's father, Joseph Michel, died in 1999, and in a 2006 interview, her mother, Anna Michel, stated that she did not regret her actions, saying,
I know we did the right thing because I saw the sign of Christ on her hands.
This next case, however, takes us into a house where something evil was lurking in every room. It was so disturbing that the home's address was eventually changed.
30 years ago, a truly horrifying crime was committed here, when 6 members of the DeFeo family were shot dead in a single night.
Oh, see? Yeah, that's what I was saying, bro.
Amityville Horror is a 1979 American supernatural horror movie directed by Stuart Rosenberg, starring James Brolin, Margaret Kidder, and Rod Steiger. The movie follows a young couple, George and Kathy Lutz, who purchased a home unaware that it had been the site of a gruesome mass murder just a year earlier. And after moving in, they began experiencing terrifying supernatural events that eventually drove them out after just 28 days. On Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, stood a beautiful Dutch colonial home with 5 bedrooms, a boathouse, a pool, and a huge yard. It was occupied by the
Damn!
Defoe family: Ronald, Louise, his wife, and their 5 children. Ronald Jr., known as Butch, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew. Wealthy, respected, and Italian-American Catholics who attended church every Sunday. But inside the house, things were far from perfect. Ronald Sr. was controlling and extremely strict, and his temper could turn dinner time into chaos within seconds. And at the center of the family's problems was Butch, the oldest son. He was just like his father, angry, reckless, and spiraling out of control. He often lashed out at his father and even at his friends. And concerned, the family took him to a psychiatrist, but Butch refused refused to admit anything was wrong, and eventually the visits dropped. Trying to calm him, his family even gave him money and gifts, which included a $14,000 speedboat. But the more they rewarded him, the worse his behavior became. By the age of 17, Butch was using substances, and his violent behavior would get so bad that it got him expelled from school. But despite everything, his parents continued to reward him. At 18, Butch started working at his grandfather's car dealership, where very little was expected of him, and his father still gave him a weekly allowance, regardless of how much work he did. But instead of acting responsibly, Butch of course spent his money on alcohol and other substances. In 1974, angry about what he felt was a low salary, Butch decided to steal money from the dealership. After his father trusted him with a deposit of over $20,000 in October of that year, Butch and a friend would stage a fake robbery, take the money and split it between themselves. At first, the plan worked, until the police came to the dealership to talk to him, and instead of answering their questions calmly, Butch suddenly got very angry, and so the police started to think that he wasn't telling the truth. So they asked him to come to the station to look at the pictures of possible suspects, but he refused to comply, and this made his father suspicious. And when he confronted Butch about not cooperating with the officers, Butch threatened to kill him, and it wasn't an empty threat. At 3:15 a.m. on November 13, 1974, Butch picked up a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, walked from room to room, and brutally ended the lives of his entire family as they slept, starting with his father, then his mother, and finally his 4 siblings, one by one. The next day, Butch went to work as if nothing had happened. He even called home, pretending to be confused why his father hadn't shown up, and he left work around noon, spent time with his friends, and tried to build an alibi by telling them he couldn't reach anyone at home. At 6 p.m., Butch then walked into a local bar and shouted,
"You gotta help me. I think my mother and father were shot."
And when police arrived at the home, they found 6 bodies still lying in bed, all face down, all shot. According to officers, none of them showed signs of struggle, and when detectives asked Butch who could have done it, he blamed a mafia hitman named Louis Fellini, saying they had a past conflict at the dealership. He said he'd been watching TV late at night, left for work early, and assumed his family was alive when he left, and so police placed him in protective custody while they searched for other suspects. At first, the investigators actually believed him, but as they questioned him further, inconsistencies began to pile up, and the very next day, Butch finally confessed. He explained that after killing his family, he took a bath, changed clothes, and went to work, and later returned to the bar to stage the discovery of his killed family. He even took the police to the place where he discarded his blood-stained clothing, the rifle, and the cartridges. During the trial, Butch's defense attorney argued that he'd been possessed by an evil entity, that the house itself had forced him to commit the crime. But of course, the jury didn't actually believe it, and by the end of the trial, he was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But just because Butch was behind bars didn't mean the story was over, because only a year later, in 1975, George Lutz, his wife Kathy Lutz, and their 3 children moved into the same house. But it didn't take long for them to realize that whatever had driven Butch to kill his family was still there. When the Lutz family moved in, many of the Defoe's belongings were still inside, the furniture and even the crucifixes hanging on the walls. It felt like a dream house, until the house began to wake up. It started small, cold spots, windows that refused to stay closed, strange smells, like old perfume mixed with decay. But then came the sounds. At night, doors slammed by themselves, and Kathy woke up to footsteps in the hallway, but no one was ever there. And every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., the time the Defoes were killed, George woke up drenched in sweat, feeling as though someone was staring at him. And George, who was normally calm and reserved, began to change. He grew irritable, paranoid, and became obsessed with chopping wood to keep the house warm, even when it wasn't cold. Now one night, he heard the sound of a band playing downstairs, but when he went to check the living room, no one was there, although the rug had been rolled up and the furniture moved, as if someone had cleared space for dancing. As for Kathy, she started having nightmares about the family that lost their lives. The dreams were so vivid that she felt like she was witnessing them firsthand, and sometimes she even woke up with deep scratches across her body. And the children also said they'd made a new friend, a little girl named Jody, whom no one else could see. Now as the days passed, the house
A demonic pig-like creature with glowing red eyes. Jeez. Jesus.
they'd made a new friend, a little girl named Jody, whom no one else could see. Now as the days passed, the house grew more violent. One night, Kathy was said to have levitated off the bed while the crucifix on the wall flipped upside down. And so terrified, but with nowhere else to go, the Lutz family invited a priest named Father Ralph Pecoraro to bless the home. But during the blessing, he heard a deep voice hiss,
"Get out."
and horrified, he left. And after that, things got even worse. Flies appeared in the middle of winter, black stains oozed from keyholes, and George claimed he once walked into the living room and saw the outline of a pig's face with glowing red eyes staring at him through a window. And with everything happening, the Lutz family lasted only 28 days in the house. And so on January 14, 1976, they fled in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. And when the Lutz haunting became public, it spread instantly. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, famous for their
Yo, the
works on
goats, bro, the goats.
hauntings arrived to investigate, and Lorraine felt a
presence of pure evil.
the moment she entered the house. Apparently, a demonic force that was so powerful she became physically ill, and they would later conduct a psychic investigation, but couldn't actually figure out anything. A year later, the Lutz family told their story to writer Jay Anson, who turned it into the best-selling book The Amityville Horror, and Hollywood then adapted the book into the legendary movie. Since the 1970s, the Amityville house has changed owners multiple times. Some repainted the famous quarter-moon windows to make it less recognizable, and others changed the address from 112 to 108 Ocean Avenue, trying to erase the legend altogether. As for Butch, he passed away in prison in 2021, and until his final days, he insisted that something dark had taken over him that night. However, what comes next is a real-life nightmare of a woman that haunted her victims in broad daylight.
Next thing she knows, a gun pointed at her, and there's a man looking at her through the window.
The movie Wolf Creek is a
I don't know this one.
brutal Australian horror film about three backpackers who run into a sadistic killer, Mick Taylor, played by the actor John Jarrett. After their cars break down in the remote outback near Wolf Creek National Park, their trip turns into a horrifying fight for survival as they try to escape his isolated camp and the horrors he puts them through. But the story didn't just come from one real event, it was inspired by two different true crime cases in Australia. In the early 1990s, many young people from different countries visited Australia. They carried large backpacks and moved from place to place exploring the forests and deserts. They were called backpackers, and at the time Australia was seen as a friendly, peaceful place. Many people thought nothing bad could happen there, but around 1990 to 1993, terrible things began to occur to travelers in New South Wales, near a place called Belanglo State Forest, as people would start to go missing there. One by one, backpackers started disappearing. Some were from Germany, others from the United Kingdom, and even native Australians traveling inside their own country, and the police were simply confused. These missing travelers came from different places, but what connected them all was simple, and they all passed close to Belanglo Forest. On September 19th, 1992, a couple of runners training for a race went into the forest, and while running, they saw something strange sticking out of the ground. It was a bone. The next day, police discovered a second body about 30 meters away. Dental records identified them as Clark and Walters, who possibly hiked around the forest. It turns out Walters had been stabbed 15 times and had 4 wounds to her chest, 1 to her neck and 9 to her back, which would have caused paralysis. As for Clark, he had been shot 10 times in the head. No other bodies were found around the area again. However, on October 5th, 1993, a man collecting firewood found bones deep in another remote part of the forest. And when the police got there, they located 2 more bodies, later identified as Gibson and Everest. Gibson's remains were in a fetal position and showed 8 stab wounds, 1 cut through his spine, paralyzing him, and others punctured his heart and lungs. Everest had been violently beaten. Her skull had 2 fractures, her jaw was broken, and knife marks were found on her forehead. She'd been stabbed once in the back too. And that's not all. On November 1st, 1993, police sweeping the forest found another skeleton belonging to Schmidl, who had been stabbed at least 8 times, including wounds that severed her spine and pierced her heart and lungs. Clothing at the scene didn't match hers though, but belonged to another missing backpacker, Hapschi. And on November 4th, 1993, the police found the bodies of the German couple Hapschmied and Neugebauer in shallow graves about 50 meters apart. They went missing on December 26, 1991, while hitchhiking from Sydney to Melbourne. Hapschmied had been decapitated and her skull was never recovered. Neugebauer had been shot 6 times in the head, and evidence from several remains suggested that some victims had been tortured or had not lost their lives immediately. And so as a result of all of this, on October 14, 1993, the New South Wales Police created Task Force Air with more than 20 detectives and analysts. And on November 4th, the NSW government increased the reward to find the perpetrator to $500,000. Using link analysis technology, investigators reduced their suspect list from 230 names to 32. Some believe the attacks might involve multiple criminals since most victims were in pairs, killed in different ways and buried separately. But on November 13th, the police received a call from Paul Onions, a 24-year-old from the UK. He explained that on January
Bro, Paul Onions. That's funny.
25th, 1990, while backpacking in Australia, he accepted a ride from a man calling himself Bill near Mittagong, which is less than a kilometer from Belanglo. He pulled out a revolver and rope to rob him, but Paul ran and Bill fired at him, but he managed to escape and flagged down Joanne Berry, who was driving by. She then gave him a ride and helped Paul report it to the police. Now on April 13th, 1994, detectives found the original police note from that day, and Joanne's testimony, along with information from a co-worker of somebody named Ivan Mila, confirmed the details of Paul's assault. Police investigated families who lived near the forest, and one name just kept appearing again and again. They were a large family that lived close to the Belanglo forest, and they knew the forest, the back roads, and the hidden areas very well. Now this man, Ivan Milad, seemed especially suspicious because he had guns, knives, and a past record of violence. So the police decided to search his house. They found a lot of weapons, including 2 types of .22 caliber rifles, a pistol, and a large knife. They also found things that belonged to some of his victims, and even more of these victims' belongings were found in his mother's and brother's home. Now Ivan Milad's siblings later said that he'd shown antisocial and violent behavior from a young age, They recalled him attacking animals with machetes, which led to him being sent to a residential school at age 13. By 17, he was already in juvenile detention for theft, and at 19, he was caught breaking into a shop. And so in 1964, Ivan received an 18-month sentence for breaking and entering. And only a month after his release, he was arrested again for driving a stolen car and was given 2 years of hard labor. In September of 1967, at age 22, he was then sentenced to 2 to 3 more years in prison for theft. On April 7, 1971, Ivan then abducted 2 18-year-old female hitchhikers near Liverpool railway station while armed with a knife. He took advantage of one of the girls, but both managed to escape when they stopped at a cafe at a petrol station. Ivan was then arrested later that day and charged with taking advantage of people and armed robbery. And while awaiting trial, he committed several other robberies with some of his brothers and then faked his death by leaving his shoes at the Gap, a well-known location. Authorities believed he fled to Queensland and Victoria and then flew to New Zealand and lived there for 2 years. However, investigators suspected that he may have secretly returned to Australia under a fake passport, and this was actually the case. And so Ivan was rearrested in 1974 after his mother was hospitalized with a heart attack. But the robbery and kidnapping charges were actually dismissed with the help of Ivan's family lawyer, John Marston. In 1975, he then began working as a truck driver, a job he continued on and off about 20 years. But despite that, he still continued with his crimes, because in 1977, he attempted to take advantage and kill 2 female hitchhikers traveling from Liverpool to Canberra, but there were never any charges filed. Now back to the 1990s, the police surveillance at Ivan's home discovered that he'd recently sold a silver Nissan Patrol shortly after the bodies of Clark and Walters were found, and they also confirmed that Ivan hadn't been at work on the days of the attacks, and his acquaintances described his intense fascination with weapons. And so when the police linked the Bangalore State Forest killing to British backpacker Paul Onion's earlier escape from an armed attacker, Paul actually returned to Australia and identified Ivan as the man who called himself Bill and tried to shoot him. Ivan then appeared in court on May 23rd but didn't enter a plea, and on May 31st he was formally charged with 7 counts of murder. On June 28th, he fired John Marston, their family lawyer, and requested government-funded legal aid. Meanwhile, his brother Richard and Walter faced charges involving drugs, weapons, and stolen property found in their homes. Now, Ivan's trial opened on March 26, 1996 at the Supreme Court of New South Wales, with prosecutor Mark Tedeschi handling the case. And despite the extensive evidence, he remained confident he would be found not guilty. In phone recordings made for the ABC's Australian Story program in 2004, he stated his grounds, saying,
"My basic defense in my trial was that it wasn't me. I don't know who did it. It was up to them to prove my guilt, not for me to prove my innocence."
And his defense team argued that all the evidence was circumstantial and attempted to shift suspicion onto other Milad family members, particularly his brother Richard. A total of 145 witnesses took the stand, including relatives who attempted to provide alibis. Ivan himself testified on June 18. On July 27, 1996, after 18 weeks of testimony, the jury then found Ivan Milad guilty of all 7 murders. He received 7 life sentences with no chance of parole. He was also convicted of attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery of Paul Onions, receiving 6 years for each charge. In the movie, Ivan Milad's crimes showed the idea of a friendly driver turning into a dangerous hunter who chose lonely places where people couldn't escape, and this became a big part of the character Mick Taylor and Wolf Creek. But this is actually only half of the inspiration of the movie. In July of 2001, a young British couple named Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees were traveling across Australia. They were excited to explore the long desert roads, but they didn't know someone was actually following them. They drove through the Northern Territory, where the land is flat and empty for hours. There are long roads with no houses, no towns, and sometimes even no phone service. And then a strange driver would appear. Late at night, a white van came behind them and flashed its headlights. Peter thought the driver wanted to warn them about something, so they stopped the van on the side of the desert road. A tall man came up to the window. He looked normal. Nothing felt strange. And so Peter stepped outside to talk to him, but Joanne stayed in the car. Then she heard a loud bang, and she never saw Peter alive again. The attacker then came for Joanne.
Why would you do that, Peter? Peter, why would you do that?
He tied her up and tried to drag her away, but she fought with everything she had, till she managed to break free and ran into the desert. She hid behind bushes for hours. The desert was freezing. There were snakes, insects, and wild animals. But Joanne still stayed hidden until she heard the attacker's car drive away, and when she felt like the man was gone, she ran into the road and waved her arms until a road train driver stopped for her at 12:35 a.m. He and his co-driver picked her up and took her back to Barrow Creek. The Lee Springs police were then called at around 1:30 a.m. after Joanne escaped. The police arrived at around 4:20 a.m. to collect evidence and listen to what Joanne and the 2 drivers saw. And then at 7 a.m, the police, along with Vince Miller, who was one of the drivers, and Joanne went back to the area and started searching for Peter, the Toyota van, and the man who attacked them. And when the police returned to the place where the attack happened, they only found a pool of blood on the side of the highway. And they also discovered the couple's combi van hidden about 80 meters away in the thick bushes. And search teams looked through the area, but found almost nothing besides Joanne's footprints. Peter was nowhere to be found. Now, a few days later, 4 Aboriginal trackers came from a nearby community to help, but even they couldn't find any signs of Peter or the attacker, and this was unusual and made some of the searchers uneasy. Now the media quickly turned Joanne's story into a dramatic tale of survival against all odds, and so a reward of $250,000 was offered for anyone who could help find Peter. Now in February of 2002, 6 months after Peter disappeared, Superintendent Colleen Gwynne took over the case, but the police then released CCTV footage from a gas station near Alice Springs with a man who seemed very suspicious, and they hoped that the man in the video would come forward to clear his name. But when no one did, investigators turned their attention to the registered owners of the 1991 to 1999 Toyota Land Cruiser model seen in the footage. Based on the CCTV footage, police met with Bradley John Murdoch in Bruin on November 1st, 2002. Though Joanne's descriptions didn't immediately link him to the case, he was still a suspect. But it wasn't until May 17, 2002, when Bradley's brother was actually arrested, that the investigation gained traction. Criminal evidence from his brother, along with new DNA analysis, began to tie him to the crime. During the investigation, police discovered traces of Bradley's DNA on Joanne's t-shirt, a pair of homemade handcuffs, and the vehicle's gear stick. The t-shirt DNA was found to be 150 quadrillion times more likely to belong to Bradley than anyone else. Now meanwhile, Bradley actually disappeared for quite some time when he noticed how hot the situation was getting. But despite that, on August 22nd, 2002, he was arrested in South Australia on actually an unrelated kidnapping and taking advantage of people charges. Now eventually a preliminary hearing was held in April of 2005, and the trial began on October 17th at the Supreme Court in Darwin. Now Bradley actually pleaded not guilty of killing Peter and of attacking and trying to kidnap Joanne Lees. His defense argued that the DNA could have been transferred accidentally at a fast food restaurant in Alice Springs or planted by an unknown party, and Bradley had indeed stopped at the restaurant to buy chicken for himself and his dog. So this was the explanation he presented during the committal hearing. But Joanne testified that the attacker tied her wrist, put a sack over her head, and forced her into his pickup truck. She described being wedged between the seats and then into the rear of the vehicle before she managed to escape into the dark and hide under bushes. And so on December 13th, 2005, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict, sentencing Bradley to life in prison with a non-parole period of 28 years. He was also convicted of taking advantage-related charges against Joanne, and only after the sentencing did it appear that Bradley had actually previously faced and been acquitted of aggravated SA years earlier. Colleen, the lead investigator on the case, stated,
"There was never any doubt for me that Bradley Murdoch was guilty of this crime. The challenge was to make sure we got a conviction."
Now over the years, media speculation occasionally suggested that Bradley might reveal the location of Peter's remains in exchange for better prison conditions. Bradley, however, consistently denied involvement beyond any of his original convictions. Now in 2019, he was actually diagnosed with terminal throat cancer and received chemotherapy, and on July 24th, 2025, he was released into palliative care with limited excursions, but he passed away there on July 15th, 2025 at age 67. But unlike these offenders, this next case didn't hunt strangers in the wild, but the victim was a small human who just wanted shelter over her head.
She now
That story was so long, I was falling asleep.
had to live in the filthy basement with the family's dog. From here on out, the abuse somehow got even worse.
This one, I don't know if the name sounds familiar, but I don't think I watched this one.
In 2007, filmmakers William M. Miller and Andrew Van Den Hooten produced a Hollywood blockbuster movie titled The Good Girl, based on a novel written
The Girl Next. Yeah, I don't think I watched this one. But the name sounds familiar.
by the famous author Jack Ketchum. The movie follows the story of two sisters, Meg and Susan, who moved in with their aunt Ruth after losing their parents in an accident. At first, their aunt
Bro,
sisters,
I just read this guy's lips.
who moved
He said stupid,
in with their
and then he said female dog. He said stupid female dog.
written by the famous author Jack Ketchum. The movie follows the story of two sisters, Meg and Susan, who moved in with their aunt Ruth after losing their parents in an accident. At first, their aunt seems like a strict but capable guardian, but as the days went by, her behavior became increasingly unstable and cruel. And what many viewers didn't realize is that the story is inspired by a real case that is far more disturbing than anything shown in the movie. It's October 26, 1965, Indianapolis, Indiana. A call was made from the local police department from a family home on 3850 East New York Street. Moments later, a couple of officers arrived on the scene, ready to save whoever was in distress. But what they didn't know was that they were about to witness a horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lying motionless on a thin, blood-stained mattress in the basement was a girl Bruce, burned and starved nearly beyond recognition. Her name was Sylvia Likens. In the movie, she was known as Meg, and what happened to her over the previous 3 months remains one of the most unsettling cases of human torture and killing in American history. The story begins in July 1965, with Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny, two among the 5 children born to struggling traveling carnival workers, Lester and Betty Likens.
Carnival workers? Oh no.
And because of the nature of their jobs, Lester and Betty were often on the road. But that summer, the setup wasn't suitable for young people, so they needed someone to watch them while they were gone for a few months. And that was when a woman named Gertrude Benesevsky came into their lives. Gertrude was 37, frail and struggling, twice divorced and living with her 7 children: Paula, Stephanie, John, Marie, Shirley, James, and the youngest, Dennis, in a small, worn-down house. Gertrude's daughters, Paula and Stephanie, had previously met Jenny and Sylvia in church and school, and so they became good friends. And during one of their playtimes at Gertrude's house, Sylvia and Jenny told Paula and Stephanie their parents' plan on getting them a place to stay for the summer. And Gertrude, who overheard the discussion, suggested that she was up for the task. She agreed to take care of Sylvia and Jenny for $20 a week, which is about $200 in today's money. And Sylvia's father thought it was a safe, temporary agreement. He dropped the girls off and went on the road, believing his daughters would be safe. But what he didn't know was that he was leaving his daughters in the hands of a monster. At first, everything seemed fine. Sylvia and Jenny helped around the house and played with Gertrude's children. But soon, the weekly payments from their fathers would start arriving late. And that's when everything began to change. Gertrude's friendly attitude instantly turned to rage. She started yelling at the girls, calling them names and accusing them of lying about the payments. And then came the beatings. One night, she forced Sylvia to bend over as she and Jenny got whipped with a belt on their bare back 15 times until their skin split open. And soon, this became more than just punishment. Gertrude started to take pleasure in the torture, and before long, she encouraged her own children, Paula, Stephanie, Johnny, Marie, Shirley, and James, to join in the mistreatment. But the worst part, the neighborhood kids also began coming over to watch, with some even taking part too. Among those who enjoyed
What the hell? This is some sick, twisted woman, bro. And these kids are coming as well just to watch or participate.
treating Sylvia was Coy Hubbard, Stephanie's boyfriend, who often used Sylvia as his punching bag. Now, over time, Gertrude would focus her attention solely on Sylvia, and sources claim it was because she exuded confidence and was overprotective of her little sister Jenny, who had polio and had to wear leg braces. And whenever they were whipped, Sylvia often begged to take some of Jenny's strokes. Another source claimed that Gertrude was just redirecting the anger meant for her daughter Paula, who'd recently gotten pregnant after getting into a fling with a middle-aged man. By late July, Gertrude had started spreading rumors about Sylvia, accusing her of being promiscuous and saying that she was pregnant, but none of this, of course, was actually true. Regardless, Gertrude would use these lies to justify every act of violence that followed. In the movie, Meg looked pale and dehydrated, but in reality, Sylvia appeared even worse. She became a shadow of herself. She was denied food, forced to eat leftovers, or spoiled meals. And when she was caught sharing a meal with Jenny, Gertrude delivered a humiliating punishment. She even asked her son, John, to force feed her feces out of a diaper of her youngest son, Dennis. And if that
Oh, hell nah.
That wasn't inhumane enough, in one instance, Gertrude made Sylvia strip and inserted a Pepsi bottle into certain areas, while neighborhood kids watched and laughed. And over time, the maltreatment
Entertain Gertrude and her blank was the point. The strip. Glass Pepsi bottle.
would get even worse. And by September, Sylvia was no longer allowed to sleep upstairs. She was locked in a cold, dark, and dirty basement. And soon, Gertrude would stop even referring to her by her name. Instead, she was just called the girl. Now, Sylvia was thrown downstairs and burned with cigarettes, among other very inhumane punishments. And gradually, Sylvia's once bright smile faded. Unfortunately, Jenny couldn't defend her sister, because every time she spoke up, Gertrude made the punishment even worse. And so all Jenny could do was offer comfort. And as the physical abuse wasn't enough, the psychological torture Sylvia endured was just as brutal. On some days, Gertrude would make Sylvia confess imaginary sins in front of everyone just for fun. However, one of the most inhumane acts in this entire story would be the time Gertrude and a young person named Richard Hobbs, and when they were done, Gertrude laughed and said,
"Now she'll remember what she is."
Now, a few days after this horrific experience, Richard and Gertrude's son, Shirley,
proceeded to use an anchor bolt in an attempt to burn the letter S beneath her breast. Bro, they're treating her like livestock, like what they do for like cows.
an anchor belt to burn the number 3 into her skin, and these scars would remain. At one point, Gertrude even openly taunted Sylvia about the words that had been engraved into her stomach. She told her,
"Sylvia, what are you going to do now? You can't get married now. What are you going to do?"
And Sylvia, while still in tears, responded quietly,
"I guess there's nothing I can do."
And the following day, Gertrude woke Sylvia up and forced her to write a letter, while she told her what to write word for word. The letter was intended to mislead Sylvia's parents. It said that Sylvia had voluntarily run away from her temporary home, and it also falsely claimed that Sylvia had accompanied a group of local boys and engaged in intimate activities activity with them, and that these boys were responsible for the extreme injuries on her body. Gertrude's aim of the letter was to divert suspicion and blame from her to these unknown boys. And after the letter was completed, Gertrude discussed a plan with her son John to have him and Sylvia's sister, Jenny, blindfold Sylvia and transport her to a wooded area known locally as Jimmy's Forest. And the intent was to leave her there to die, while the letter would serve as the explanation for her disappearance. Sylvia actually attempted to escape from the basement after overhearing the conversation between Gertrude and John, and despite her severe injuries and overall physical weakness, she attempted to reach the front door. However, she only managed a short distance before Gertrude caught her and prevented her escape. Following the failed attempt, Gertrude gave Sylvia crackers to eat, but due to the extreme dehydration and malnutrition, Sylvia was unable to swallow, and so Gertrude responded by forcing the crackers into Sylvia's mouth and then striking her repeatedly with a curtain rod. The force of the blows bent several sections of the rod at sharp angles, and Coy Hubbard then took the rod from Gertrude and continued beating Sylvia until she lost consciousness. And once Sylvia was no longer responsive, Gertrude dragged her back into the basement. Later that night, after regaining consciousness, Sylvia tried to get the attention of neighbors by screaming for help. She also struck the basement walls with a spade in an attempt to make noise, but despite her efforts, no one heard her. By the morning of October 26th, Sylvia's condition had significantly deteriorated. She was unable to speak clearly, and her ability to move her limbs was severely impaired. Now Gertrude brought her upstairs into the kitchen and popped her against the wall and attempted to feed her a donut and a glass of milk, but Sylvia couldn't even lift the glass to her mouth, and so in frustration, Gertrude threw her to the floor and sent her back to the basement. Shortly afterwards, one of her daughters, Paula, went down to the basement, and she instructed Sylvia to recite the alphabet, but Sylvia was only able to get through the first 4 letters. She was also unable to lift herself off the ground, and so Paula became angry and verbally threatened her, saying that if Sylvia did not stand up, she would perform a long jump onto her. That after
The hell is a long jump? I just know the track and field event long jump. The hell is a long jump? Inflict a long jump? Yeah, I've never heard that. Gertrude then ordered Lycans who had pooped to clean herself.
afternoon, Gertrude returned to the basement with several of the children, and Sylvia made weak attempts to raise her hands and identify the people around her by saying,
"You're Ricky and you're Gertie."
and Gertrude just immediately told her to be quiet, responding sharply,
"Shut up, you know who I am."
Gertrude then instructed John to spray Sylvia with a garden hose in an attempt to clean her, but the cold water just caused Sylvia to panic, and she made another attempt to crawl toward the stairs, but before she could reach them, she collapsed. Gertrude walked over and stamped on Sylvia's head, and then stood over her for several moments before walking away. Now at approximately 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs arrived at the home, and he went directly to the basement, but the floor and stairs were so wet from the house that he actually slipped and fell as he reached the bottom. And when he stood up, he found Stephanie, one of the daughters, crying and holding Sylvia's severely injured body. Realizing how poor Sylvia's condition was, Stephanie and Richard attempted to help. They carried Sylvia upstairs, gave her a warm and soapy bath, and dressed her in clean clothes. They then placed her on a mattress in one of the bedrooms. And during this time, Sylvia actually managed to speak, which would be her final words, expressing that she wished her father was present, asking Stephanie to take her home. And moments later, Stephanie noticed that Sylvia was no longer breathing. She attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but despite this, Gertrude insisted that Sylvia was faking it. She picked up a book and struck Sylvia's body, repeatedly shouting,
"Faker, faker."
but Sylvia Likens had died. She succumbed to her injuries. And when there was truly no response, Gertrude actually began to panic. And then she asked Richard to go to a nearby payphone and contact the police. At approximately 6:30 p.m., police arrived at their residence, and Gertrude led officers into one of her bedrooms, where they found Sylvia's body lying. Immediately, she handed officers the letter she had forced Sylvia to write earlier, claiming it explained the circumstances leading to her death. But Jenny actually took up the courage and whispered to one of the officers,
"You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything."
Jenny's full account immediately alerted officers to the truth of the prolonged abuse and torture Sylvia had endured. And within hours, police arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John on suspicion of murder. Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also later arrested the same day. Now, Sylvia's remains were transported to the morgue, where investigators conducted an autopsy. And that was when the full extent of her suffering was revealed. Her body was covered in over 150 wounds, including burns, bruises, and cuts. Her fingernails were broken backwards from trying to escape, and the words written on
Oh, hell nah.
her stomach were still visible. Her lips were swollen, and even other parts were almost swollen shut, and she weighed only 50 pounds. The official cause of Sylvia's death is subdural hematoma, which results from a severe blow delivered to the right side of her head, and the injury would have caused bleeding between the brain and skull, leading to rapid neurological decline. And when the news of Sylvia's death reached her parents, who were hundreds of miles away still working the traveling carnival route, they couldn't believe their ears, because they'd actually visited the girls twice and didn't notice anything strange. They were relaxed and trusted Gertrude to care for their daughters, and also sent $20 every week without fail. For 3 months, they believed everything was fine. They had no reason to doubt her, but trusting Gertrude turned out to be one of their biggest mistakes. Witnesses including Jenny testified for hours. She recounted everything that happened, and even the night her sister whispered to her ear,
"Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it."
Gertrude showed no remorse. She blamed the children, claiming they acted on their own, but the jury of course
Electric chair. Did we get her in the electric chair back then? Nuke the whole family, bro. Nuke the whole family.
didn't believe her. And so on May 19, 1966, Gertrude was found guilty of first-degree murder and a sentence of life imprisonment. Paula was guilty of second-degree murder. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John were each found guilty of manslaughter. And on May 25th, Gertrude and Paula were formally sentenced to life imprisonment. The same day, Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard and John received sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. We served at the Indiana Reformatory. In the courtroom, Gertrude and her children became emotional as they bid themselves goodbye, while Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard showed no emotions. Sylvia Lycan's funeral was held on the afternoon of October 29 at the Russell and Hitch Funeral Home. The service was led by Reverend Lewis Gibson and attended by more than 100 people. But in a shocking twist, Gertrude was actually paroled in 1985 after serving just 20 years. And when she came out, she changed her name to Nadine Van Fossa and lived quietly until her death on June 16, 1990. Unlike this case, the next one doesn't involve a human.
Okay, that one was just... That one woke me up. The last one put me to sleep. This is... I don't even want to watch the movie. That is just horror. That's just sad. That's not even like horror, bro. That's sad. That's like inhumane to do to another human being.
Predator. The evil actually came from within the walls of a house, and it would not let go.
The Perrons also claimed to have encountered demonic forces at the farmhouse, who would pull on the girl's hair and limbs during the night. Banging doors and disembodied cries were also a regular occurrence.
Let's go, The Conjuring. And I like this movie. This is a good movie. I like this one.
When The Conjuring, a supernatural horror movie, premiered in 2013, many people were shocked by how
peak horror movie, bro. We got The Conjuring, we got Sinister, we got The Babadook, we got what's it called? I forgot, bro. It was the big three. It was The Conjuring, Sinister, Insidious. Bro, imagine being alive during the peak horror movie era, bro. Back to back to back. Conjuring, Sinister, Insidious. Stop playing, bro. Gas. Fire.
real and unsettling it felt. Most viewers assumed it was a fictional ghost story, but the movie was actually based on a real family and a real investigation conducted by Ed and Lorraine Warren. In 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perron bought an old farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. The house had 14 rooms, creaky floors, long hallways, and a dark attic. And they moved in with their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. And at first, they didn't seem anything supernatural. They unpacked their box, cleaned dusty shelves, and tried to fix the old heaters. But after just a few days, small, strange things began to happen. Carolyn noticed her broom constantly moved from place to place. Sometimes it disappeared completely, and other times it stood in a different spot than where she left it. She would clean the kitchen floor only to return minutes later and find small piles of dirt mysteriously appearing in the center of the room, and no one in the family had done it. And later that night, the floorboards creaked loudly even when everyone was asleep. Doors opened on their own, and footsteps echoed down empty hallways. And things only got worse. One morning, Carolyn walked into the kitchen and froze. Every food jar was open and scattered across the floor, despite no one in the house touching them. And soon the children began reporting strange things too. Christine and Andrea said they sometimes saw an old woman standing in the corners of rooms, and she appeared only for a second before disappearing. Shadows slid along the walls, and chairs moved as if someone had pushed them, and cold spots suddenly formed around Carolyn, even when the heat was on. And at night, whispering voices called her name, and sometimes she woke up to find her bedroom chair tipped over by itself. Now, despite everything, the family tried to rationalize it. They told themselves that old houses make noises, or that the wind, the settling wood, or the pipes were responsible. But deep down, all of them knew that something else was happening. Even their pets sensed it. The dogs growled at empty corners, and the cats refused to enter certain rooms. The house didn't actually feel like a home anymore. It felt like something was watching them. As the months passed, the activity grew stronger. Christine would see a woman hanging from the attic rafters, and Andrea saw a man with a white face and black eyes watching her from the corner of her room. And one night, the girls screamed so loudly that Roger and Carolyn ran upstairs, and they claimed that something had pulled them out of bed. And the house also
I remember that scene in the movie.
seemed to have certain places that felt especially dangerous, like the attic, the basement, and Carolyn's bedroom. Roger, for example, hated going into the basement, because the moment he walked down the stairs, he felt a cold, rotten smell, like spoiled meat. It was as though someone was standing right behind him, so he only
Oh, I remember this scene too.
went down when the heater broke, something that happened way too often unfortunately. And by 1972, the haunting was no longer just sounds and shadows, it became physical. Carolyn would wake up with long scratches on her body, deep enough to bleed, and she didn't know how they got there. And she also started sleepwalking. Some nights she woke up in the kitchen staring at the wall, unable to remember walking there. And in her bedroom, she saw a shadow press against the door, which vanished when she turned on the light. And sometimes when she lay in bed, she felt a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Then came the night she woke up and felt the entire bed sinking downward, as if something invisible was sitting on top of it. She screamed for Roger, but when he arrived, nothing was actually there. On another night, Christine and Andrea kept crying because they were covered in bruises they couldn't explain, and sometimes a so-called spirit would drag them across the floor or pull them down the stairs. And eventually Nancy, the youngest, would even refuse to sleep in her bed at all, just out of fear. Now the parents tried everything possible to silence the force that was tormenting their family. They spoke to their neighbors, and as devoted Catholics, they called a local priest to bless their house and spray over each room, hoping that faith would drive away the spirits. They did stuff like sprinkle holy water and recite prayers at night, but nothing actually changed, nothing worked. Trying to understand what was happening, Karen looked into the history of the house, and that was when it all started to make sense. The property had been in one family for 8 generations, and many of the people who lived there died in mysterious or tragic ways. Some of the children had drowned in a nearby creek, and one person had even been murdered, and a few were said to have left this earth on themselves in the attics. Among all the spirits the parents believed lived on the property in the mid-80s was Bathsheba Sherman. She was considered the most dangerous entity present in the house.
Whoever the spirit was, she saw herself as
I remember her too. I just forgot the name.
the true mistress of the house, and she didn't like that my mother was taking that role,
said Andrea Parent, the oldest daughter. Bathsheba was rumored to practice dark magic, and some people believed she was involved in the death of a neighbor's child, although she was never put on trial. She was later buried in a small Baptist cemetery in downtown Harrisville, and the Parent family believed it was Bathsheba's spirit that tormented them throughout their time in the house. Then one evening, there was a knock on the door. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren had heard rumors
The goats.
of ghosts, demons, and strange events at the Parent home, so they arrived uninvited. Roger Parent wasn't happy about their arrival. He didn't trust paranormal investigators and feared that they might make things worse. Andrea also said many times in interviews,
my father never called the Warrens. They showed up at our door.
During the visit, Lorraine Warren held a seance to try to speak with the spirits, and during the session, Carolyn began speaking in strange unknown languages and even lifted off of chairs. Roger was terrified and kicked the Warrens out because he feared for his wife. And after the Warrens' visit, the activity didn't calm down. It grew worse. Carolyn apparently was once lifted off the ground and pinned against the wall by an invisible force. Doors slammed so violently that the house shook, and family members became trapped in rooms that were locked by themselves. And also strange symbols appeared on the walls. And one night, Carolyn saw a dark shape crawl out of the fireplace. It moved towards her in a strange way, slowly and twisted, before disappearing into thin air. Now for years, the Parent family actually stayed in the house because they couldn't afford to move. They were trapped. So instead they adapted. They learned which rooms were dangerous. They learned to avoid the basement, and they learned that the nights were the worst. They even learned which spirits were harmless. Andrea, for example, later said,
not all of the spirits were malevolent. Most were just curious about us. But there was one. She despised my mother.
By 1979, however, the family couldn't take it anymore. The children were exhausted and Carolyn's health was declining. And Roger was overwhelmed and constantly worried. And so they finally made the decision to leave quickly. They packed only the essentials, leaving behind furniture, clothes, and toys, and almost everything they owned. In June of 1980, they were finally able to move out for good. But even after leaving, they felt permanently changed. The family believed something from the house had followed them.
The house never wanted us to leave in peace.
Andrea later said.
It stayed with us.
Today, the Parent haunting is one of the most famous paranormal cases in the world, and Andrea even wrote a book about it called The House of Darkness, House of Light, claiming that it contains the most comprehensive account of everything that had happened in the house. Now, after the movie came out, people found out about the real story, and a lot of them had their speculations. Some believed that the house was actually haunted, and some think that the family was under stress, while others believed that the Warrens actually exaggerated things. However, next is a case that shows how some horrors aren't supernatural, and they're simply born from a twisted mind.
In March 2001, he killed a man and ate him, along with a glass of fine red wine.
Grim. I never watched this one either.
In 2006, German music video director Martin Weiss released a haunting thriller called Grim Love. The movie follows Katie, a young American criminal psychology student who travels to Germany to research her thesis on a notorious killer named Oliver Hartwin, a man infamous for dismembering and consuming his victims. In the movie, Oliver had spent years online
German, European movies. I have to dig to find these niche horror movies.
searching for someone who would willingly let him kill and consume them. And eventually he came across a man named Simon Grombeck who agreed to participate in this
Oh, let me run that back.
The movie follows Katie, a young American criminal psychology student who travels to Germany to research her thesis on a notorious killer named Oliver Hartwin, a man infamous for dismembering and consuming his victims. In the movie, Oliver had spent years online searching for someone who would willingly let him kill and consume them, and eventually he came across a man named Simon Grombeck who agreed to participate in his deadly fantasy. But as Katie
I literally watched I watched a video on this guy. It was like the internet's darkest things. I literally watched a video on the real life case of this.
dug deeper into the case, she became deeply obsessed with Oliver, even mimicking aspects of his lifestyle in an attempt to understand his motives. Through a series of flashbacks, she uncovers the full story behind Oliver and Simon, and the dark path that led both of them to their tragic fate. But while the movie was incredibly unsettling, the actual real-life story behind it was even worse. It all began with a man named Armin Meis, who lived in a quiet town in Germany called Rothenburg. Armin's father Gustav had left the family when Armin was still a child, leaving him to grow up with his mother Waltraud and two older brothers. Armin's mother was extremely strict and controlling. She followed him everywhere, told him what to do, how to act, and even who he was allowed to talk to. She would often humiliate him in public by revealing his private secrets and calling him the pet name Minchen. Because of this, Armin grew up lonely and struggled to make friends. In 1980, after his older brothers moved out, he and his mother relocated to the quiet hamlet of Wüsterfeld, part of Rothenburg an der Fulda. Their property included a sprawling 44-room mansion and a set of pony stables, and the area had only about 30 residents, which meant even more isolation for Armin. Now, after he entered puberty, his mother prohibited him from having a girlfriend, and during this time he created an imaginary friend in his mind named Frankie. Armin began showing signs of severe psychological issues, experiencing intimate fantasies about Frankie, specifically desired to become one with Frankie by consuming his body. His fascination with the idea of consuming humans initially came from an experience during a childhood summer vacation in rural Wüsterfeld, where he witnessed farm animals like cattle or hogs and deer being killed and butchered for the first time. As an adult, Armin then developed a deep interest in extreme violence and cannibalistic fantasies. He kept recordings of television documentaries about the Vietnam War and read accounts of notorious killers such as Fritz Haarmann and Jeffrey Dahmer. Privately, Armin also filmed
Of course, Jeffrey Dahmer.
Amateur videos in which he pretended to perform disturbing and graphic acts, the details of which were never fully released to the public. In these recordings, he covered himself in ketchup, for example, to imitate blood, and hung upside down like a butchered carcass. He would also eat stuff like minced meat shaped to resemble human flesh. For decades, Armin kept these fantasies to himself, until early 1998, when he discovered secret online chat rooms like Nullo and the Cannibal Cafe on the dark web, where people with extreme
I watched this guy, not Yapmaster, but I watched the video on the guy who talked about this.
fantasies could openly express themselves. To hide his true identity, Armin used the alias Frankie and the username Antraphagus. He claimed to be a butcher and used the identity to describe his fantasies and communicate with potential volunteers. But unlike most users in this community, Armin did not see these fantasies as fiction. He wanted to carry them out in real life. And in early 2000, Armin became extremely active on the internet. He wrote more than 60 advertisements on Nullo, a site dedicated to extreme and unusual fantasies. In these English-written ads, he said he was looking for a well-built young man between 18 and 30 who was willing to be killed and then eaten. He also posted the same ads on the site Cannibal Cafe. At the same time, Armin searched for people who claimed they wanted to be killed and eaten, and he eventually met two men and had long conversations with them. The first one was a 20-year-old Austrian who used the name Luke. Eventually, he told Armin that his own family planned to kill him during their holiday celebration in January of 2001, so he no longer needed Armin's help. Now the second man used the name Matteo from Italy. Matteo initially
Okay, that's crazy, bro. This guy literally was like, yeah, I don't need your help because my family's gonna kill me already. So that it's okay.
agreed to an extremely dangerous plan involving pain and heat, but he later changed his mind when he learned that cannibalism was part of the fantasy. Now, because Matteo seemed serious at first, he asked Armin to prepare a special room. Armin then converted part of his attic into what he called a slaughter room. He added a metal bed frame, a folding table, two small nightstands, and equipment Matteo had asked about. He also decorated the room with mannequins and other items, and placed mattresses and boards around the walls to dampen the sound. He took pictures of the room and sent them to Matteo, but he of course never visited. By now, most people backed out once they realized Armin was actually serious. They wanted fantasy, but again, Armin wanted actual reality. And in June of 2000, Armin then met a man named Jörg Buß, who used the username Meatboy. They shared their interests on Yahoo Messenger and would eventually become close friends. Later that year,
That's crazy. I never used Yahoo Messenger. That was before my time. I only had the MSN.
they met in person. and after 2 normal meetups in Kassel, they decided to try 2 staged slaughter sessions. And so on the 12th of November of 2000, Armin and Jörg had their first trial in a hotel in Kassel. Armin covered Jörg in olive oil, drew circles on his body, and discussed which parts of his body he would cut into. But of course it was staged, so they never actually went through with it. Now the second session took place on November 19, 2000 at Armin's house. This time when Jörg saw the actual slaughter room, he became frightened and told Armin that he was leaving, and he, unfortunately for Armin, never returned. And although Armin was disappointed that his plans fell through, he believed it was only a matter of time before he found someone who was right for it. And so in early 2001, Armin posted a new advertisement on the Cannibal Cafe, stating,
"I'm looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old to be killed and then eaten."
And this time on February 5th, 2001, a 43-year-old computer engineer from Berlin named Bernd Jürgen Brandes used the alias Cater99, and he responded to the ad. And Armin didn't even need to pursue it. Bernd wanted this. On March 9, 2001, Armin and Bernd finally met to carry out their plan. Bernd took a train to Rothenburg and went straight to Armin's estate, where Armin lived alone following the death of his mother the previous year. The two men spent hours talking together, embracing and preparing for what they both described as a consensual plan. Armin even set up video equipment to document the event and gathered tools and instructions he downloaded that detailed how to process a human body. Bernd consumed a large amount of alcohol and over-the-counter medication in an attempt to dull the pain and slow his awareness. Now several times Bernd hesitated and even briefly tried to cancel the plan, telling Armin he believed he was too gentle to harm him. But after briefly going out and buying a return ticket, Bernd changed his mind again, insisting the plan continues. On their way back, Armin bought a 20-pack Vivinox sleeping pills and a bottle of cough syrup, and Bernd consumed roughly half of each. Now at the house, instead of falling into the attended deep sleep, Bernd became actually disoriented and started hallucinating from the drug combination, and so he drank schnapps to calm himself. At around 6:30 p.m, Armin made his first attempt with Bernd, but the blade he actually used was too dull, so he took a sharper one and removed Bernd's private stuff. Bernd screamed in pain, and after Armin was done, he bandaged the wound, and the two then attempted to eat stuff together. Now Bernd actually couldn't because it was too tough and chewy. Armin then tried it with salt and pepper, wine and garlic, but the meat actually became burned and became inedible. Now meanwhile, Bernd actually grew increasingly weak from blood loss, alcohol and medication.
Yeah, you see, I'm not reacting to what he said because I already know from the previous video what he did. I'm just here to listen to any extra details that wasn't covered.
And Armin actually cared.
But yes, this guy cut off the dude's genitals first, cooked it, and they both tried to eat it, but the dude was like, it's too chewy. So tried to add some seasoning, and then it just got worse.
For him for hours, running him a warm bath and checking on him repeatedly and helping him when he drifted in and out of consciousness. Now eventually Bernd actually became collapsed and became unresponsive, and believing that Bernd was dying or already dead, Armin proceeded with the rest of the plan they'd agreed upon. And after a long period of hesitation and reflection, Armin ended Bernd's life completely and completed the dismemberment that followed. And the entire incident was actually recorded on a 4-hour-long videotape that has never been released. Now over the next several months, Armin stored portions of Bernd's remains in his freezer under pizza boxes and ate them over time, while burying the bones under his house. Now Bernd's family didn't actually immediately notice his absence, but his partner Renee J filed a missing person report on March 12, 2001, but the police actually had no leads to go on. Now between 2001 and 2002, Armin went back into those online forums constantly. He met with a couple different men between 30 and 40 who contacted him because of his online posts. Sometimes they came to him and sometimes he traveled to different cities to meet them, and at least 4 of the men actually said that they were willing to be killed, but all except one changed their minds when they realized that Armin was serious. His username was Andreas from Regensburg, and he let Armin tie him up and pretend to prepare. When the moment came, he said he didn't want to actually die, and so they stopped and spent the evening eating pizza and drinking beer. Next was Alexander, a 26-year-old from Essen. He wanted to be killed immediately by decapitation, but Armin refused because Alexander actually seemed unsure and didn't fit the body type he preferred. Then Thomas, a 37-year-old man with a leather and boot fantasy. He allowed himself to be placed in a cage and hung upside down, but stated clearly that he didn't want to be actually killed. Now in June of 2001, Armin then met Jörg again, and they resumed their fantasy sessions. Jörg even sent photos of his co-workers and suggested bringing them to Armin to be eaten, but he refused and said he only wanted willing volunteers. They met several more times, and during one meeting in November of 2001, they repeated stuff they'd done earlier. Jörg was shaved and tied up in the attic room, but every time Armin asked if Jörg truly wanted to die, Jörg said no, and eventually they stopped because Jörg's ankles hurt and the room became too cold. However, they continued meeting on and off for about a year. Now there were a couple of other people too, but most of the time Armin simply invited the men for intimate activities or roleplay that didn't involve any attempt to actually kill them, and he met with people like this about twice a month. Now on July 9th, 2002, a 23-year-old university student from Innsbruck, Austria, searched the internet for horrors and nervous thrills, and while browsing he came across one of Armin's Armin's new online advertisements. And curious, the student sent Armin an email asking a simple question, and Armin of course replied yes. The student was shocked and disgusted, and he wrote back to Armin expressing how wrong and disturbing it was. Now months passed, but the student still couldn't forget the message. And so on October 27, 2002, he finally reported Armin's email address to the police, believing a serious crime had been committed. Now police in Wiesbaden began investigating, and it took them almost 2 months to figure out who Frankie really was. And of course they eventually traced the username back to Armin. Now on December 10, 2002, police arrived at Armin's house, and what they found was deeply disturbing. Frozen body parts, a computer filled with chat messages, and the video he filmed of course, written plans and tools he used the night of the crime. Now Armin didn't resist or attempt to hide anything, he simply allowed himself to be arrested, and the next day, December 11, the police also searched his yard and found some of Burns' bones, his hands, feet and head. Armin even showed them where he buried certain parts and handed them over Burns' wristwatch. Now
1,700 diskettes. Is that like floppy disks? 228 cassettes. 221 hard drives. 16 PCs. 95 CD-ROMs. 23 magnetic tapes. Dog.
during the search, the police found a huge amount of computer and video material. In total, officers collected 1,742 floppy
Okay, he's just gonna say everything.
disks, 228 video cassettes, 221 hard drives, 16 computers, 95 CD-ROMs, and 23 magnetic tapes. And even though it was a massive collection, only 21 videotapes were found to be important to the case. On the same evening, two officers from the Hesse State Police Department began reviewing, and they stopped after locating the main tape and documented enough details to confirm the crime. And on December 13th, the police returned with sniffer dogs to search the property again. They wanted to make sure that there were no other hidden remains. Now, during the interrogations, Armin would reveal to the investigators that he ate about 20 kilograms or 44 pounds of Burns' remains over 10 months. And prosecutors claimed that he did it for intimate pleasure. However, Armin told the investigators that
My friend enjoyed losing his life, death. I only waited horrified for the end, after doing the deed. It took so terribly long with every bite. My memory of him grew stronger.
Now, Armin's trial would go on to become one of the most famous in German history, and Armin said Bernd asked for everything, so it was consensual. And the tapes actually proved that to be true, but the law actually doesn't allow someone to give permission for their own killing. Now, his defense lawyers argued that at worst, he's guilty of killing on demand, which would be punishable by up to 5 years in prison. However, in 2004, Armin was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years and 6 months in prison instead. And while many argued that the sentence was too short, there was another trial. In 2006, the court changed the sentence, and Armin was actually found guilty of murder and disturbing the peace of death, and was given life in prison. This second decision was made because the court felt like that Armin acted to satisfy his own desires, not only Bernd's wishes, and he remains in prison to this day. However, what comes next is even more unsettling, because it begins with his son's love for his mother, and ends in horror no one expected.
There's something about Geen that appeals to the morbid curiosity within all of us. It's so macabre, so bizarre, so deviant that we can't look away.
There it is. There it is.
1974, a film hit theaters that changed the movie industry forever. It was raw, filthy, and terrifyingly real. In the movie, a group of friends road trip to an old family home.
Bro, this movie's ass though. The original is so boring. It's not even funny, bro. It's literally like 75% of the movie is filler. And then like the last 25% is the actual killing. I remember trying to watch this and I literally fell asleep and then woke up and then the action was happening. And I was like, I don't care anymore. And then I just watched both the remakes. Way better pacing. Better girls actors too. Both movies, both the girls.
In rural Texas, and accidentally stumble upon a house owned by a savage, cannibalistic family. One by one, they are brutally attacked by Leatherface, a huge man wearing a mask made of human skin. The movie was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the story behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't purely fiction. It was inspired by a real man who was quiet, seemingly ordinary, and polite with people in his community, and living a low profile. His name was Edward Theodore Geen, though most people called him just Ed. He lived in an isolated old farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, surrounded by empty fields and dead corn stalks. He grew up with his his older brother Henry, his father George, and his mother Augusta, who ruled the household with an iron fist. Augusta was also religious and completely obsessed with the idea of sin. She often told her sons that women were evil, that the world was corrupt, and that only through obedience to her could they remain pure. Now Henry challenged their mother's twisted teachings, but Ed, he worshipped her. To him, his mother wasn't just family, she was God. Ed listened to every word. He didn't go out, didn't have a girlfriend, and he simply worked on the farm, read his Bible, and stayed on his mother's side. Eventually, Henry found love in the hands of a divorced mother of two and planned to move in with her, but he feared his mother and Ed's reaction. Then, in 1944, tragedy struck. Henry and Ed were burning brushes on their land when the fire spread uncontrollably. Now the neighbors rushed in to help, but the small volunteer crew couldn't contain it, and by the time the fire department arrived, much of the brushes had burned. Now Ed had been helping all along, working with firefighters and his neighbors, and once the fire was out, he realized he hadn't seen Henry for hours, and so concerned neighbors helped search. But soon, Henry's body was found face down, with visible signs of bruises on the head, but no burns. The cause of death was officially ruled asphyxiation, meaning he died from inhaling smoke, but no autopsy was actually performed, and the town's sheriff never investigated further. Now with their father having passed away from heart failure in 1940, it was now Ed and his mother left in the house. But tragically, a year later, Augusta suffered a stroke and passed away too, and with that, something inside Ed snapped. Without his mother to control him, Ed's mind began to unravel. The farmhouse fell into decay. Piles of trash, old newspaper, and jars were filled with strange liquids, scattered everywhere. The only parts of the house that remained tidy were the sitting room and his mother's bedroom, which was preserved like a shrine. Ed lived alone for decades, and he only did odd jobs like babysitting for neighbors and sometimes visiting the local tavern. But then, strange disappearances began in Plainfield. The first time was in 1954, when a tavern owner, Mary Hogan, vanished. Her regular customers arrived one morning to find that she never opened the bar, and no one had seen her since the previous evening. Only a pool of blood was found behind the bar, but there wasn't any leads. 3 years later, something similar happened. On the opening day of deer hunting season, November 16, 1957, Bernice Warden, a 58-year-old widow, worked alone in the Warden hardware store. Now Ed drove into town that morning, carrying antifreeze, and later he inquired about buying a rifle. Now the village of Plainfield felt strangely empty. Almost every man in town except Ed was out in the woods hunting, which left the streets quiet and still. Bernice's son, Frank, had gone hunting like everyone else. Now at around 9:30 a.m., the Warden hardware pickup truck left town, unnoticed. Nobody saw a struggle or a sound, and the strange shaped object at the back went unseen. Not long after the truck left the store, Ed walked calmly to his own car and drove away. Ed was familiar with the Hill grocery store at the edge of Plainfield. He often bought small groceries there and spent evenings watching TV with the family because they had no electricity at home. And that night he stayed for dinner. They had pork chops and afterwards played a small game with one of the younger Hill children. Then suddenly Jim Roman, the Hill's son-in-law, burst into the house. He had heard something terrible. Something had happened at the Warden store, and the police were gathering. Everyone was shocked. Everyone except Ed, who simply looked up and said calmly,
"Boy, someone sure must have been bloodthirsty. Is that right?"
Back at the Warden store, Frank Warden returned from hunting at around 5 p.m. As he approached the shop, it was unusually dark and the door was locked. Something felt wrong immediately. He crossed the filling station opposite to the store and asked if anyone had seen his mother. Panic gripped him as he unlocked the store and stepped inside. The moment he walked in, his breath almost ceased. There was a pool of blood on the floor near the counter, a long, dark trail of blood that slowly, steadily toward the back door. Frank followed it, and when he reached the back, he noticed something else that made his stomach drop. The hardware truck was gone. Really panicking now, Frank rushed outside and straight to the phone. He called the sheriff, and trouble was the only word he could actually say. And both the sheriff and the deputy Annie Fritz arrived as fast as they could. And when they got there, Frank showed them the trail leading back to where the truck should be parked. Now at 6:15 p.m., more police officers came, and when the officers searched the store and yard, Frank was asked if he suspected anyone, and he answered immediately, saying,
"Ed Gein."
And upon asking why, Frank recalled that Ed had asked his mother to go roller skating, and he had come in the day before to ask about antifreeze. He also asked Frank whether he would be out hunting or not that day. And when he checked the sales slip, there was a slip that had Ed's name on it. It was an invoice for the antifreeze. And the officers remembered the case of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who disappeared years earlier. Her tavern looked almost the same. A pool of blood, drag marks, and a truck missing. And so one of the deputies actually said,
"We always suspected Ed for Mary Hogan. We never had proof. But this is the same thing."
Now the police then drove to Ed Gein's farm, but it was dark already. There was no light anywhere, and so they approached the back door. But Ed wasn't home, so instead they drove back to the Hill grocery store, and there the police actually spotted Ed sitting calmly in his car with one of the Hill boys. Now one of the officers walked up to him and said,
"Eddie, I'd like to talk to you."
Ed didn't resist, he didn't question, and he just got out of the car and followed him like a quiet, obedient child. In the control car, the officer then began asking him about the state, and Ed told a story, and the police then asked him to repeat it after he told the story. But something changed in the second telling, small details shifted, and so the officer said,
"Eddie, your stories don't match."
And Ed looked straight ahead and murmured,
"Somebody framed me." "Well, Mrs. Warden. What about Mrs. Warden?" "Well, she's dead, isn't she?" "Dead? How do you know she's dead?" "I heard it." "Where did you hear it?" "I heard them talking about it."
And that was the moment the officer knew that they had their man. He placed Ed under arrest. Now while Ed was being driven to jail, the rest of the police decided to go back to the farmhouse and take a more careful look. They pushed the door open to a small outbuilding known as the summer kitchen, and the smell hit him immediately. A horrible mixture of cold air, old wood, and something far worse. There, hanging from a wooden beam, was a body hanging like an animal in the slaughterhouse. At first they thought it might be a deer, but the closer they looked, the more their stomachs twisted. It wasn't a deer. It was Bernice Warden. She had been dressed out, just like a hunter would show off their killings. And even seasoned officers who'd seen accidents and death for years were shaken. Her body was carefully lowered and placed in a plastic bag, but Bernice Warden was actually just the beginning. Not long after, they conducted a more thorough search through the house, and it was filled with debris, old bones, stacks of newspapers, clothing thrown everywhere, random objects, tools, and garbage. It almost looked like a maze of rot and shadows. But worst of all, mixed among the junk were also human remains. They found a shoebox filled with female organs. They also
Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag. In a burlap. Bernice's head in a burlap sack.
found chairs with seats made of stretched human skin, lampshades made from skin, a knife handle carved from bone, and whole human bones and fragments. Leggings made from human leg skin, masks crafted from skin of female heads, and
pair of lips on a drawstring. Bro, yo, this guy was on some next.
Other very disturbing.
A belt made from human female blank. What is it? It has to be. How do you even make a belt with? If he's censoring it, it has to be private part or chest area.
Stuff. And they also found Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who'd vanished 3 years earlier, in a plastic bag. And as horrifying as the house was, one room stood out. The door to Ed Gein's mother's bedroom that had been nailed shut for years, ever since her death. And when the officers pried it open, they found something completely different. A perfectly clean bed, neatly folded clothes, and furniture that was untouched. There was no dust and no chaos. It was the only normal place in the entire house. Now during the investigation, Ed admitted to killing Mrs. Warden and 51-year-old Mary Hogan, but he claimed that he had no memory of the details surrounding her death. And according to him, most of the items found in his house didn't come from people he killed. Instead, they came from graveyards. Following his mother's death, Ed began visiting cemeteries at night, and he would dig up their bodies and bring them home, and then use their skin to build a new woman, for example. He also crafted a woman's suit he could wear so he would become his mother. He believed he could bring his mother back by rebuilding her piece by piece, using parts from other women and wearing them. Now, he denied ever having intimate contact with the bodies, explaining that they smelled too bad, and he described entering a dazed-like state. Now, investigators had to see for themselves by inspecting the graves he identified, and they found evidence exactly as he described, including empty caskets, partial remains, and tools left behind. Now, because of how gruesome the suit and other items Ed was making were, the real photographs weren't publicly released except these two. Every other picture
human face. That's a fork and spoon made with someone's bone.
circulating throughout the internet are mere counterfeits. Now, during the
man, that's how it's real.
Investigation, one of the sheriffs reportedly attacked Ed by banging his head and face against a brick wall, and because of this, Ed's initial confession was ruled inadmissible. The sheriff was actually so traumatized by the horrors he witnessed and the stress of testifying about the assault that he died of heart failure in 1968 at the age of 43 before Ed's trial. Now, after his arrest, Ed was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia and severe psychosis, and the court would actually determine that he was unfit for trial, so he was sent to Central State Hospital for criminally insane. And so Ed Gein spent the rest of his life in mental institutions and died quietly from cancer in 1984 at the age of 77. He would later be buried side by side with the rest of his family. Now, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't a direct retelling of Ed Gein.
Yeah, I was literally about to say, as we were watching this is completely different from the movie. Because the movie portrays the family a lot. The guy's family was dead. It was just him. But in the movies, the family is very evident in the entire film. Maybe that's why it made it better. Because if it was just him, would it have hit the same? We don't know.
Crimes, but still the real life story is very much as disturbing as the horror movie. Now, this last one is probably the most disturbing out of all of them.
I know a couple of times to make sure somebody was dead, I would scratch the eyeball with the knife.
Rewake, I've never heard this movie.
In 2010, filmmaker John Molofsky created a horror movie called Freeway Killer. It starred actor Scott Anthony Lee, who played the role of William Bonin, a fugitive on the run from the police. The man, who was a Vietnam veteran living in Southern California, had recently been paroled as an offender, and by day he's a seemingly ordinary truck driver. But by night, he prowls the freeways in his van with his young, devoted accomplice, Vernon Butts, played by Dusty Sorp. They offer rides, drugs, or money to males, and then handcuff, take advantage of, torture, and kill them, dumping the bodies beside the highways. The movie alternates between the increasingly sadistic killing inside the van, William's manipulative home life with his mother and friends, and the police investigators. And the true story happened in Southern California too, between 1979 and 1980. And quite a lot of people remember this time as one of the most frightening periods in California history. Especially younger people kept disappearing mysteriously, only for their bodies to be found on the side of the freeway days later. And the man behind all this was of course called William George Bonin. He was born on January 8, 1947, in Connecticut, USA. His childhood was very difficult and painful. His parents drank too much and didn't take care of him and his brothers, and sometimes they even left the children alone for days. Now eventually William and his brothers were sent to foster homes, but even there William faced maltreatment. When he was young himself, the older boys bullied him and often took advantage of him. These experiences damaged him and filled him with anger and confusion, and so when he got older he joined the US Air Force and fought in the Vietnam War. And during this time he learned the terrible habits of violence after seeing suffering and death. And when he came back home, he was no longer the same guy. He changed. He was unstable, angry, and dangerous, but no one truly knew how bad he would become. Before starting the freeway killings, William was already hurting people in different ways. In 1969, he was arrested for kidnapping and NSAing younger boys, and he went to prison for it. But the doctors there actually recommended him to go to a hospital instead. They said he had serious psychological problems, so he was placed in a treatment center. But after a few years, William was actually released. The doctors believed that he had improved, but they were wrong. William quickly started hurting younger people again, and in 1975 he was arrested once more for taking advantage of younger people, and again he spent time locked away. But by 1978 he was free again, and soon after he got out this time, the killings began. Between 1979 and 1980, at least 21 young men were killed, most of them between the ages of and 19, and people believe the number may have been even higher because some victims were never actually identified. William had a routine. He drove around in his brown Ford van looking for young people walking alone, hitchhiking, or waiting at bus stops. He always acted friendly, and some boys then got inside thinking he was giving them a ride home, but of course they never actually made it there. Once inside, William used ropes, wires, or even his own hands to attack them, and so the victims were found with their hands tied or with marks showing that they fought very hard to survive. After killing them, he then threw the bodies on the side of different freeways, and this is how he became known as the Freeway Killer. And one strange and frightening part of this case is that William didn't always work alone. He had several partners who helped him find victims, grab them, or hurt them. These partners were Vernon Butts, who was a factory worker who loved horror, magic, and dark fantasies. This made him join William in several of his attacks. The second person was Gregory Miley, a young man who helped William grab victims and found intense pleasure in the extreme violent acts. And the last of his accomplices was James Monroe, a teenager who looked up to William and followed him. Now, as more of the bodies were found, the people of California grew terrified. All of the victims were young people who simply wanted to get home and hang out with friends or walk to school, and so parents all over California quickly warned their children not to hitchhike, and newspapers printed story after story about boys found near freeways like Interstate 5, Route 101, the Ventura Freeway, and the Harbor Freeway. Now, each time he actually killed someone, his method looked the same, and this was the clue that made the police know that a serial killer was actually out there, but they didn't yet know who it was. Detectives worked non-stop. They studied every crime scene, and they looked at the knots used to tie the victims. They compared injuries and slowly began to see patterns, and the police also studied reports of suspicious vans seen near the victims. And then came the ultimate break. A young man told authorities he'd once escaped a man in a van who tried to tie him up, and he of course gave a description of him and the van, and the man he described was William Bonin. The detectives then placed William under surveillance. They wanted to see what he actually did, and so they followed him secretly for days. And then on June 11th, 1980, the police saw something suspicious. William stopped his van near a young boy, and the detectives watched as the boy walked up to the van, and they also watched William open the door, and the boy got inside, and that was it. And from that point on, the police moved in fast, and when the police opened the van, they saw horrifying killing tools like ropes, knives, wire, handcuffs, binding materials, and bloodstains. And these were the equipment William used in many of his crimes. The boy inside the van was fortunately still alive, but the police believed he wouldn't have stayed alive much longer if they hadn't stopped William right there and then, and so he was arrested on the spot. Now, after his arrest, William actually first denied everything, but soon he began to talk. He gave long interviews and confessed to a lot of his crimes. He even bragged about what he'd actually done. He showed no guilt, and he didn't seem to care about the victims or their families, and he also told the police about his partners.
Electric chair. Please.
William went to trial in 1981 and later in 1983 for more killings. The courtroom was emotional, with parents crying as they heard what happened to their children, and so William was found guilty of kidnapping, taking advantage of people, torturing, and killing them. He was sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, the correctional facility known for its death row inmates, and he stayed on death row for a couple of years. And even while in prison, he showed no true remorse. He even sometimes wrote letters to people, including supporters who were strangely interested in him. He also saw drawings and crafts from prison. But finally, on February 23rd, 1996, William Bonin was killed by lethal injection. He was the first person in California to be killed by that method. He was 49.
You should electric chair. No, you can't. You can't give him the easy death. He has to suffer.
Years old. Before he died, he gave a final statement.
That I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. That I feel it sends the wrong message to the youth of the country. Young people act as they see other people acting, instead of as people tell them to act. And I would suggest that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, that they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously.
He didn't apologize to the victims, and instead he just complained about the death penalty and said that he wanted the violence in society to end.
Is this guy for real? Oh, good thing he's dead. Alright, time to watch it again. I'm joking. That was a super long video. Oh my god. I already know, looking back at that one section, that you're gonna see me start dozing off. That story was so boring, I'm not gonna lie. No, it's not your fault, Yapmaster, it's just that story was boring. Let me find that one again. What is it? This one?
On October 14, 1993, the New South Wales Police created Task Force Air with 120 detectives and analysts. And on November 4th, the NSW government made a new friend, a little girl. She figured out anything. A year later, the Wolf Creek is a brutal
Yeah, this was so boring. And that was like the longest one too, I swear. Oh wait, no. Okay, it's not that long, but it felt long. That was a W video though. W Yapmaster. Give that video a like. See, he watched Veronica. He said, I watched Veronica. Crazy. I mean, not crazy. Not for the week, but it was alright. See, he can handle it too, bro. I'm telling you. Yo, when they say that, the only people you trust is YouTubers or like the TikTok iceberg. The people who do the iceberg videos, they know if it's actually messed up. If it's by the public media, don't listen to them. It's not that scary. They say it on the news, it's not that scary. They'll be like, this movie is so scary. People peed their pants and fainted. Okay. Up the cap. Anyways, that was a crazy long video. Hope you guys had a big ass dinner, lunch while watching this one. You're watching it on your TV. Hope you guys liked it. You can definitely see my energy go from high to low and then back to high and then to normal throughout this whole video. Because man, I was like super energetic because I was like, oh, I know these ones. And then this one, this freaking Wolf Creek, put me to sleep, bro. And then it came back with the crazy aunt who did that to the poor girls. What was that movie called? Bro, I said I don't even want to watch that movie. I just want to know the name.
15th, 2025. Small human who just wanted shelter over her head.
She now had to live in the abuse somehow got even worse.
The girl next door, yep. Okay. Well, but that was disturbing horror movies based on terrifying real cases. If you guys like the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you're new here, thanks for staying till the end and watching, and subscribe for more horror disturbing reactions to endgames. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.